Thank you for joining me for another episode of Awaken and Power TV. I'm your host, Ethan Fox. Today I'm joined by Dr. Robert Schoch, who will be joining us here in person at the Awaken and Power Expo, November 4th, 5th, and 6th in Detroit, Michigan, in the United States. Today we speak about the many megalithic sites around the world and how they relate to a lot of solar activity that occurred in and around the time of the Ice Age and the end of the Ice Age, and how that connects to solar activity that's occurring in the world right now, and what that means as far as the implications to our current civilization. We also speak about consciousness and the emerging consciousness in the world, a variety of interesting subjects, and Dr. Robert Schoch will be joining us here along with a lot of other amazing presenters, including Michaela Sheldon, Dr. Eric Pearl, and also Winston Shrout. And of course, I'll be doing a presentation there as well. And a variety of other amazing presenters, Ken Chorley doing a demonstration on telekinesis, and also an exhibitor area that's open to the public for free if you'd like to join us there for that as well. So, and some amazing musical performances on the Friday night of our opening of the event as well. So join us for that. And in the meantime, without any further delay, here's Dr. Robert Schoch. Hello, Dr. Schoch. Welcome to Awaken and Power TV, and thank you for joining me today. And I think you're calling from your home, which is what, in Philadelphia?
No, Boston.
Oh, Boston.
Yeah, Boston, because I teach at Boston University, so I live right in the Boston area.
Great. So let's start by talking a little about, obviously you teach there, so I'd like to establish a little bit of background about you and talk about your educational background and anything that's relevant to the work you ended up doing that that led you to what you're doing even now.
Mm-hmm. So I don't know where should I start? I'll start with the undergraduate. I actually was born in Washington, D.C. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, and I went to George Washington University as an undergraduate. I got degrees actually simultaneously, but two separate degrees, one in anthropology, one in geology. And even before I went to college in DC at George Washington, I liked to spend a lot of time in the museums. So I think that was one of the influential things on me in my very early youth, is growing up in the DC area, going to the Smithsonian Institution, the museums at the Smithsonian in particular, and they really inspired me with both a love of art and a love of antiquity. And I would say that those were two themes that really came together in my early youth. I can actually remember going to see a Tutankhamun exhibition when I was in the single digits, put it that way. I was younger than 10 when that occurred. I think I was only 4 or 5, but I still remember that, at least vaguely. So I grew up in that environment. I never really thought that I would go on to study ancient civilizations exactly the way I have. When I first went to undergraduate George Washington, I actually wanted to study art history, and that was my passion and love at the time. Although I had done a lot of reading in literature and science, I was sort of interested in everything. It was hard to try to focus exactly what I wanted to do. I very quickly decided against art history because, and I hate to sound the wrong way, I was sort of bored by it because I had spent a lot of time in museums studying art history just on my own and studying paintings and sculptures, etc., including ancient sculptures and art. And I didn't find the, should we say, program of study very challenging. I was also taking, at the time, freshman undergraduate first semester. I had to take some kind of required science courses. You had to get, have distribution, so many science credits, humanities credits, etc. So what did I do? I took a geology course. I thought that sounded interesting. And the way I didn't take just any geology course. I insisted on taking the majors course, even though I wasn't planning to be a major in geology. And I found geology absolutely fascinating, not only because the subject matter enthralled me and it goes back to antiquity and then fossils, that type of thing, which really inspired my imagination at the time. But what I was most impressed by was the first faculty member I had, who was an incredible geologist, but also did not know all the answers. And he was very honest about that. And what I learned very quickly, that geology, and this applies to all of the sciences, and I think in most cases you don't get this from a freshman course, because in most freshman courses they just tell you the answers and you're supposed to memorize, and that's the way it is. But he was very, very honest in saying that we don't know everything. We don't understand many things as to how certain rocks form, or there's aspects of Earth history that to this day are somewhat mysterious. And we would go on field trips in the DC area. We would go there, he would lead it, but he would bring colleagues along from the Smithsonian or from George Washington or other institutions of higher learning. And I remember being fascinated when, for instance, 3 faculty members or 3 professors and maybe someone from the Smithsonian, they would all stand around, and they were not only teaching us undergraduates, but they were speaking among themselves and arguing and disagreeing as to the interpretation of the rocks and exactly what they meant. So I thought this was a field where there was a lot of vitality. There was something to learn, and there was also a possibility of making real contributions. So I got hooked on geology. And instead of the art history, I went into geology, but I still had the love of, should we say, humanity and looking at human endeavors. And that led to archaeology. At the time at George Washington, archaeology was within anthropology. So I ended up getting a major in anthropology, also focusing primarily on what we call physical anthropology, archaeology, that type of thing, versus ethnography, ethnology, or linguistics. But all of those fascinate me. That's part of my problem. I've always been fascinated by everything. So I graduated from George Washington with a couple of degrees. I didn't know what to do, literally. The logical thing for me to do would be to go work for an oil company, because I had a degree in geology. It was a time when oil companies were looking for new recruits who had just gotten an undergraduate degree in geology, who, they would hire them, pay them well, train them, actually offered higher education. I could have gotten a master's degree, maybe a Ph.D. through a geology company at no expense, but I was not inclined that way. I didn't feel comfortable with that. I was, I guess, somewhat of an environmentalist even back then. And since then, I've actually written a book, or co-authored a book on environmental science, a textbook that's widely used. So I didn't know what to do. I was talking to a friend of mine who was a bit older, and he was back in DC working. He had gone to Yale as an undergraduate. He said, "Oh, Yale University, that's a nice place to go." So I applied to Yale for graduate studies. I got in. And the next thing I knew, at the end of the summer, I was moving to New Haven, Connecticut, and I was a graduate student in geology and geophysics at Yale University. So I went there for 4 years, received my Ph.D. and a couple of master's degrees in geology and geophysics. After that, to make my career very short and succinct, I worked at Yale Peabody Museum for a year as a special assistant to the director at the time, but I couldn't stay there forever. I had to get, quote, a real job. So I applied for jobs. I was hired at Boston University as a full-time faculty member, and I've been at Boston University ever since 1984. So I've been there a very long time from that perspective, but I like it there. And it was really once I got to Boston University that I became involved not in strictly geological research, which is what I was doing up to then, but in 1990, by invitation of a colleague who I got to know, I first went to Egypt to study the Sphinx, the Great Sphinx, from a geological perspective. And the first thing that really brought me on the scene, should we say, and sort of, how should I say, I hate to sound the wrong way, but essentially international attention ultimately was my geological work on the Great Sphinx, and in particular redating the Great Sphinx. And it was that event, and this was 1990 that I first went to Egypt. It was that event over a quarter century ago that really put me on the path that I've been on ever since.
And you mentioned in childhood you went to the Tutankhamun exhibit. Were there any other early influences that or interests that you had in this area?
There were many when I was young. I loved the museums. I went to the Tutankhamun exhibit, which was a big deal because at that time, to even allow antiquities of that nature outside of Egypt was, exceptional. But there were other influences, and I think that one thing I've always tried to do is look at evidence and be very open-minded. And I give a lot of credit to my late grandmother, who I was very close to. She was from the Netherlands. She was Dutch. She had come to America, and that's how my family ended up in America, at least on that side. My father came from Germany. But my grandmother, she was very open-minded. She was very intelligent. But she was not afraid to discuss things that were, should we say, controversial. And she and I would discuss things, something that I'm sure you're familiar with and many of your listeners may be familiar with is the Theosophical Society, Theosophy. She was actually a longtime member, even in the Netherlands, before she came to America. So this is the early part of the 20th century. She was a member of the Theosophical Society. So I grew up literally as a youngster reading theosophy and theosophical books. And they were very strange, very different, of course, from conventional thinking. And I did not, should we say, believe all of it, because in fact, she encouraged me not to believe anything, but to question, to look at evidence, to keep an open mind. And that had an incredible influence on me. I realize in hindsight that we need to look at the evidence, and we need to look at evidence as objectively as possible. And something I've found myself doing throughout my career is really questioning paradigms, questioning worldviews, questioning accepted conventional orthodox thinking on many things. And I'm not doing that just to question per se, but I do that when I see evidence that doesn't seem to align with the standard paradigm. So that was another major influence.
And that's very interesting. That really explains how you approach a lot of the work that you approach, because you've had this spiritual sort of influence early on in life.
Exactly. And I think that was very important to me that I had that influence. I feel very I'll say blessed that I had her. And I remember having these discussions with her. And even as a young child, I realized how, should we say, narrow-minded people could be and how closed-minded. And she assured me that I was right to try to be open and to think about things and have these thoughts and experiences. She didn't put that down.
Now, you recently got married, right?
Yes. Well, 2010, Katie and I were married on Easter Island. We were there actually for a combination research trip to see the sites. We traveled with some friends of ours, and we knew we wanted to get married, so there we were. We got married on Easter Island, and I'm sure everyone knows what Easter Island is. It's a land of the Moais, the big heads and torsos that to this day remain one of the ancient mysteries, we'll put it that way. So, have you been there before?
I've never been, no.
No, it's an incredible place to visit. We'll be back there actually in January. Once again, we're leading a tour there, and my research, it ties in with my research very intimately at this point, what is happening on Easter Island. But again, one of those mysterious places in the sense that we don't understand everything about what's going on Easter Island. And like many sites, I think it goes back much earlier than the conventional historians and archaeologists have believed, and there's solid evidence for that. And I think it's part of the bigger picture of ancient civilizations and early ancient civilizations that I've now been researching for the last quarter century or more.
Well, I found it fascinating prior to getting on this show with you that you married someone who has a fascination for astrology and studies astrology and other more spiritually based or metaphysical subjects, being an academic yourself. So how has that influenced your perspectives or the direction that your work has taken since then?
Oh, she's Katie, my wife, Catherine Ulysses, has been an incredible influence. Yes, she is very involved in astrology. And as she says, and this is her phrase, she sees it as a fragment of ancient wisdom. And I have really come to believe that. And I want to be very careful here, because there is a lot of bunk out there. There's a lot of nonsense, that type of thing. To just go to the newspaper and look up your horoscope in the little paragraph that might be there. This is not what we're talking about. We're talking about real, genuine astrology, looking very carefully at the alignments, how they can affect things on Earth, affect people. And what I'm finding as I look into these things is that, yes, there are real correlations, and you cannot just dismiss those. And moreover, I'm convinced at this point that we are starting to get to the bottom of why there could be such correlations. I think it has to do with a number of different effects, things like geomagnetic effects, electromagnetic effects between the sun and the earth, and basically the earth system, the magnetosphere, the geosphere, we could use that term. And there are a lot of things, and sometimes people use it, and it sounds to academics many times, this is just, some of my academics will say woo-woo. But in fact, these subtle influences, these things like Schumann resonances, the most basic electromagnetic vibrations on Earth that circle the Earth, they have a very real effect on humans. And this has been now demonstrated experimentally. It's been demonstrated by correlations between emotional behavior and various, we'll call it psychic phenomenon that correlate, for instance, with changes in the geomagnetic flux. And we're finding that even things like radioactivity actually fluctuates very, very slightly relative to the distance between the Earth and the Sun, relative to solar flares, relative to our position, essentially in space. So there's a lot of things that I think are now breaking through in hard science, demonstrating that what the ancients knew all along, maybe at a different, we could call it intuitive level, that we are connected to the cosmos, that the cosmos has a real effect on us. And, without having the influence of someone like Katie to get me looking at this, and gotta be very honest. I mean, we'll talk about these things. She'll suggest that such and such, I'll call it certain aspects, if I hope I'm using the correct term, astrologically could suggest this or that. And sure enough, things play out. Or sometimes, and you have to do it both ways. I'm a scientist. Sometimes things play out and we don't understand why, or I don't understand why. And then she shows me the aspects afterwards, and it starts to all make sense. So when you start gaining these correlations consistently, I'm not the only one in the sciences that's starting to find this or be convinced of this. You have to start looking at, well, how can this be? What are the causal mechanisms? And I think we are finding real causal mechanisms. We're starting to get there and to acknowledge that we are part of a larger system. We on Earth, we as individuals, that's all interrelated to each other, and there are very real effects. Like I said, I do want to be careful because, and I'm an academic, are there a bunch of, charlatans out there? Absolutely. But you don't want to throw out, what's the saying, the baby with the bathwater. You have to really look at what is genuine, what's real, what are really good correlations.
So tell me about some of the more recent research that you've been doing and discoveries you've made. In particular, you mentioned Easter Island. I know you've also been doing some work in Göbekli Tepe, and it sounds like most of your work is pointing toward a lot of these ancient structures, such as even including the Sphinx, as being dated much farther back than conventional archaeologists would tend to agree is their actual dating. So tell me what you've been finding and what leads you to believe, and how far back into antiquity you're dating these different sites, and what makes you come to that conclusion.
Yeah, really. Okay, so I'll try to summarize the core of my research over the last 25 years and sort of bring everyone up to speed. I sort of came on the scene, if I could use that term, by going to Egypt. This was 1990. I was invited to Egypt by someone, we'll call him a rogue Egyptologist. I think he'll use that term for himself sometimes. His name is John Anthony West. Some of your listeners may have heard of him or know who he is. I just saw him recently at a conference, and we were together in Egypt, Katie and I, and John Anthony West in Egypt this summer, continuing the research. So this is an ongoing research project. But I first went to Egypt at his invitation in 1990 because he wanted a geologist to look at the Sphinx, because he had questions about whether the traditional, accepted, conventional, orthodox dating of the Sphinx was correct. The conventional dating is 2500 BC, approximately 2500 BC, so about 4,500 years ago. And the Sphinx is said to have been built, carved in Old Kingdom dynastic times under the pharaoh Khafra, also known as Shepra, in about 2500 BC. And just to give everyone an image, if they haven't been to Egypt to see the Sphinx, and this is important to what I'm going to talk about, the Sphinx does not sit up on the plateau. It's on the Giza Plateau, where you have the Great Pyramid, the Second Pyramid, the Third Pyramid. And interestingly, the Great Pyramid is the only surviving wonder of the ancient world, and it's still there for everyone to see. The Sphinx sits in its shadow, but it doesn't sit above ground. Only the head is above ground. To carve the body, they cut down into the rock, so it sits in what's known as the Sphinx enclosure. So I went to see the Sphinx, this is 1990, as a geologist, and immediately I recognized, and this is what John Anthony West had been alluding to, but he had to have confirmation from someone that was a specialist. I immediately recognized that, number one, the body of the Sphinx and the walls of the Sphinx enclosure are eroded and weathered by essentially rain, precipitation, water runoff. And this is absolutely incompatible with the Sahara conditions, the hyper-arid conditions that have persisted in that region for the last 5,000 years before the Sphinx was supposed to have been built. So there was an anomaly here. There was something wrong here, something that didn't make sense from a geological point of view. Also, and this really did happen in the first minutes, even seconds of when I saw the Sphinx. I said the head is too small for the body. It's out of proportion. And I stick by that to this day. In fact, I've developed that further, that it is not the original head on the body. It's a dynastic head. Yes, maybe the head is 2500 BC, but what we have is the body, the core body, the older portion of the Sphinx, the original Sphinx, was weathered by water, weathered by rain, in pre-Sahara time, so that makes it much earlier than dynastic times. So it has to push it back well before 3000 or so BC. So that was a very radical view. With Thomas de Becky, a geophysicist, we pursued seismic studies around the Sphinx to look at what was underneath. We found subsurface weathering features that I could calibrate and date. To make a long story short, at this point, as I speak, to you in 2016, I am convinced that the Sphinx goes back, probably the original Sphinx goes back to, we'll say roughly at least 10,000 BC or so. So it goes back to a very, very early period. Now, let's tie that in with some other developments since the early 1990s. When I first talked about the Sphinx even being maybe 5,000 BC, that was my initial tentative, let's not get too crazy, let's not push it too far back suggestion. The Egyptologists went wild. They were livid. It couldn't be. It was impossible. They immediately said I was talking about aliens or who knows what. They were calling me a pseudoscientist. There was a documentary made about it called The Mystery of the Sphinx, which was aired by Charlton Heston. That aired in 1993 and on NBC. That only made the Egyptologists and the conventional archaeologists and historians more livid, because they say, oh, now he's just trying to be on television or something, which was never my intention at all. And there was actually a debate at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And the question that was posed effectively was, well, if the Sphinx is so much older, it shows sophistication, it indicates what we can call as what we can label civilization. There's such incredible sophistication when you carve a huge statue like that. Furthermore, when they carved it, they cut out huge limestone blocks and reassembled them as was now known as the Sphinx Temple and Valley Temple, which are very ruinous, but they're still there to see. So they said this was impossible unless there was an earlier civilization. And they also said, well, there's no evidence of any earlier civilization anywhere on Earth going so far back. So this is the very early 1990s. Mid-1990s, very quietly, a man by the name of Klaus Schmidt, Herr Professor Dr. Klaus Schmidt, unfortunately he's now deceased, but he started excavating a site in southeastern Turkey under the auspices of the German Archaeological Institute. So meticulous excavations, no question about the methodical work he was doing. This is the site of Göbekli Tepe, near the Syrian border in southeastern Turkey. And he started excavating it, found that it consists of incredible megalithic stone circles, essentially Stonehenge-like, but much more beautiful. Instead of big, rough-hewn stones, you have circles of stones that are beautifully carved, smooth surfaces. They have animals and in relief on them. They have what I would call symbolic notation on them. Some of them are anthropomorphic with arms and hands and belts and loincloths. Just incredible workmanship. If you just looked at it, and archaeologists have said this to me off the record, you just look at it, you might think it was 600 or most 1,000 BC. It turns out, based on geological analyses, based on radiocarbon dating, based on stratigraphy, that the site goes back much, much earlier. In fact, it goes back to over 10,000 years ago. Portions of the site go back 12,000 or so years, and it was intentionally buried. It was intentionally covered over by 8,000 BC, by 10,000 years ago, maybe a bit earlier than that. So here we had essentially the answer to my critics. Is there evidence of sophistication elsewhere? And we have it at Göbekli Tepe. There's no doubt that, in my mind, that this represents a level of development that we should refer to as civilization. And I talk about this in my book, Forgotten Civilization. So if people want more information on it, they should refer to that. So here we have evidence from the Sphinx. We have it at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, that there was sophisticated civilization going back to the 10th millennium BC. Just for round numbers, let's say 10,000 or so BC. But it disappears. It absolutely disappears. And when we look at the archaeological record, if we go to, say, 7,000, 6,000 BC, we don't find anything like that whatsoever. what we find is our sites, for instance, like Çatalhöyük, and this is a site I've also studied in Turkey, where it's 2,000 years earlier than Göbekli Tepe, a couple of thousand years earlier than my dating of the origins of the Sphinx, yet it's much more primitive. We have mud brick dwellings all sort of clumped together. We don't have monumental stone structures. So what is going on here? And what I've been doing is trying to figure out what's going on here, and it ties in intimately with the end of the last ice age. I'm a geologist. Something that has fascinated me since my graduate school days is the end of the last ice age and what happened, what was the timing, what was the cause, and now I think all the pieces are coming together. So let me explain that. Based on Greenland ice cores in particular, as well as other evidence, we now know that the ice age ended 9,700 BC, almost exactly 9,700 BC, because we can count back looking at ice cores, and basically layers of ice serve like tree rings. So you can literally count back. And we also know, looking at what's known as microstratigraphy, looking at the isotopes, that it happened incredibly suddenly. In fact, in some ice cores, you can look at this year is the ice age, this year is the ice age, this year is the ice age, and then the next year is post-ice age. And it ended literally within weeks or days, or maybe literally, within a day. So something very, very dramatic happened. I think that whatever happened, it caused huge cataclysms and catastrophes on Earth, and essentially it demolished, it wiped out these early civilizations. So civilization essentially went into decline. It was destroyed around the world, and we went into a dark age. And all the conventional archaeologists, when I was growing up, what I mean by that is when I was an undergraduate, when I was a graduate student, and even to this day, the conventional wisdom is that civilization first arose about 4,000 to 3,000 BC in places like dynastic Egypt, in places like Mesopotamia, southern and middle Mesopotamia, 4,000 to 3,000 BC. But we have these sites going back to 9,000, 10,000 BC. So there's this disconnect. And what I believe happened is that there was an earlier cycle of civilization, that's my term for it, that arose by the end of the last ice age, was decimated when the ice age ended catastrophically. These civilizations couldn't survive. Essentially, humanity went into a dark age, and it was the re-emergence of civilization in the 4th millennium BC, 6,000 or so, 7,000, 6,000 years later, depending on exactly where you are in the world, but thousands of years later, and that there was this dark age. So what caused the end of the last ice age? That is maybe one of the key elements, and that ties in with places like Easter Island. And actually, we mentioned astrology and looking at cosmic influences, cosmic events. What I'm piecing together, and I'm not the only one working on this. For instance, there's a plasma physicist at Los Alamos, Dr. Anthony Perrott, who's also working on these types of issues. What I've determined, because I've actually put the dating on it, he's put a lot of the evidence together, but what we're determining is that there was a major solar outburst in 9,700 BC that essentially, to use a colloquial term that some people have thrown out, fried the Earth, literally snapped us out of the last ice age, caused incredible cataclysms and catastrophes and decimation on the surface of the Earth, essentially wiped out that early cycle of civilization. And what you have to think about is the sun going crazy, erupting what are known as CMEs, coronal mass ejections, major solar flares, all directed at and hitting Earth. This would have numerous effects at high latitudes where there are huge glaciers, kilometers thick. Many of them would have melted virtually instantaneously at lower latitudes, where you had essentially what looked like huge lightning bolts in some places hitting the earth or hitting water. It would evaporate water. In some places, we have evidence of what's known as vitrification, and I've just documented that, I believe, on the Giza Plateau now this summer, where you have intense heat hitting, and it essentially melts the surface of the rock, which then congeals again and vitrifies. Vitrification means glass. It means it forms a glassy layer. And we have this evidence around the world that this happened. In fact, an astrophysicist named Thomas Gold first discovered it and suggested this might be the case in the, I think it was 1969, when the Apollo missions were studying the moon, and he found evidence of this on the moon, because anything that would hit Earth would also hit the moon, and it would be more easily preserved on the moon. So he suggested this as early as in 1960s. He was thinking along these lines, but people say, oh, that's crazy, you know, totally different than the standard paradigm, which is that the sun is relatively stable. We don't have events like that on Earth. So there's a lot of evidence now, and there's strong isotope evidence that the sun was incredibly active in 9700 BC and thereabouts at the end of the last ice age, that we snapped out. I was going to say other effects, just to give people an image, is you melt all these glaciers, you melt water, you have vitrification. It would set wildfires in some place. It would literally incinerate things on much of the Earth. So what do we have surviving? Large stone structures. Other things would have been devastated, destroyed. It would have caused radiation levels to be very high on the surface of the Earth. So, you know, how do you escape that? The best way to escape that, this would be for short periods of time, would be to go underground, go into natural caves initially. We have mass extinctions at that time of large animals. Well, they are the ones that could not escape at 9700 BC when this hit. Humans in some places, and we have documentation of this in Turkey in particular, seem to have escaped underground, probably into natural caves initially. Probably these events returned. So I'm a geologist. I often, when I talk about this to people or to my students, think in terms of analogy of an earthquake. You have a huge earthquake, then you have aftershocks after that. So, you know, people were preparing again, I believe, at the end of the last ice age, that those that survived would prepare again, that they would start making underground tunnels, underground shelters, and we see that at the end of the last ice age. So it's all starting to really come together, I think, that we had this incredible event happening. And that has really become the focus of my research recently.
Now, I've had Dr. Paul Lavielle out on my show before, and he talks about the super wave event that happens every so many thousands of years, and
exactly.
that something is like that is due to happen right around now. Now, are you familiar with? Obviously, you're familiar with the different Yuga cycles, right? From India. Okay. Now, there's a lot of confusion or disagreement on which Yuga cycle we're in right now. Do you have a perspective on that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you want to hear it, but I do have a perspective. And I want to make a few more comments if I could, because Dr. Lavioletta and I haven't seen him in a long time, but I know him, and I cite him in my book, Forgotten Civilization. He has suggested different possibilities of what could cause things like this. So maybe a galactic superwave. I'm not sure. Actually, I'm not going to take a strong stance on what causes this, but what I do believe, based on the evidence, and whenever I say I believe something, it's always coming as a scientist based on evidence. When we look at isotope data, which which basically records, I don't want to get into a lot of technical details, but records solar activity. We have very high and very variable solar activity at the end of the last ice age. And things start to calm down, should we say, for the centuries and millennium after the end of the last ice age. Things then calm down. The sun goes, I don't want to say it goes dormant, but it becomes very stable, relatively stable, until the last half century or so, maybe the last 70 years, and especially today, is starting to become very erratic, very variable. And so one thing I believe is that the sun, like any star, this is, astrophysics, like any star, the sun goes through cycles of being very erratic and variable versus being relatively calm. And I'm talking not the 11-year sunspot cycle or some of the other cycles that are in the order of centuries or even a couple of millennia. I'm talking a cycle which, to the best of my knowledge and analysis, is on the order of about 12, 13,000 years. And we are coming up to that very erratic period again. In fact, I think we're in it right now, and we could be hit at any time by a major solar outburst. We were hit by one in 1859, known as the Carrington event, which fried telegraph lines at the time. And I don't want to sound like a doomsayer. I really don't, because I'm not that type of person. I'm not a prepper, as they call it. But I'm just looking at the real analysis, the real science. We were hit in 1859, the Earth. It fried the telegraph lines at the time, but there wasn't a lot of electricity and electrical technology. If you think about 1859, they didn't have satellites in orbit. People didn't have computers. They didn't even have, electric lights, that type of thing. So it caused relatively little damage from a global, perspective, the average person's perspective. If we were hit by 1859 size event, which is very small astrophysically, it would devastate our modern technological, electrically based, computer-based, satellite-based system. And I think Paula Violeta has talked about these things too. And other people are talking about what absolutely devastated. Oh, I wanted to mention too, along with a solar outburst, along with melting glaciers, that type of thing at the end of the last ice age, something you would have is torrential rains, as well as fires, incineration. Why torrential rains? Because you would put so much moisture into the atmosphere, it has to come back down again. So ironically, you would both have wildfires, essentially what would look like huge lightning bolts hitting in certain areas, but also torrential rains. A lot of this people say to me, and I think it's true, it ties in with, it's like a biblical scenario of flooding. And I think a lot of the myths around the world actually reflect what happened to this earlier cycle of civilization. And this gets into something that you just mentioned, the Yuga cycle, for instance, or in Western thought, we have often the concept of the gold, silver, bronze, iron age. We have Plato talking about cycles. In fact, most of the ancient cultures, I would say all the ancient cultures where we have enough information about them, they talked about cyclical phenomena. The Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians, for instance, talked about something known as Zep Tepi, which was earlier cycle of civilization, a cycle of civilization, 7, 8 or more thousand years before them in 3000 BC. So that would put it back into the last ice age. Plato talked about Atlantis and the fall of Atlantis. And if you look at Plato's chronology and put it into our calendar system, if you would, our way of counting years, when did Atlantis collapse according to Plato? About 9600 BC, which is very, very close, I say as a geologist, to the modern dating of the end of the last ice age, 9700 BC. A lot of people out there still say 9500 BC or so. It doesn't matter, a century or two, we're spot on as far as the dating. So we've got mythological data, we've got geological analyses, we've got archaeological data. And this is really, to me, all coming together. And it's very, very exciting that we're piecing together what happened back then, about 12,000 years ago, 11,700 years ago, and what could be happening in our immediate future. So yes, I do think this ties in with the cycles and the Yuga cycles. And you asked me where I think we are in the Yuga cycles, and not everyone wants to hear this, but my personal opinion, I'll be blunt, is I think we're in the Kaliyuga. I really do. I think we're in a very low, I hate to say the worst of the worst, but I think we have to be prepared. I think we have to be careful. We, yes, have a very high technology, but I do question, I hate to say it this way, but I question our philosophical, spiritual basis. And one can argue that there was a golden age half a precessional cycle ago, back at the end of the last ice age. I'm not necessarily advocating that in a very strict sense, but certainly other people have suggested that we may have had a golden age during that earlier cycle of civilization, say 12,000 plus years ago, that collapsed. And we went through this huge dark age. We're re-emerging for the last 5,000 years or so. But I do think we're in a lower order rather than a higher order, and that hopefully we can ascend, if we could use that term. But I think we have a lot of work to do, both spiritually, philosophically, and also preparing ourselves in a very real, if I could use the term, materialistic sense. And sometimes all the materialism that we have now is not the best thing in the world, and all our dependency on high technology is not the best thing. Something that I feel very strongly about is that we are subject to future catastrophes. I think in particular a major solar outburst, and I don't know if I said this already, but you and I were talking about perhaps off the air, President Obama just a couple of days ago. Today is the 15th, October 15th, as we are being interviewed, and I think it was just 2 days ago that he signed an executive order looking at and trying to prepare for what's known as space weather events, essentially solar outbursts and other disruptions coming from outside of the Earth system. So there is now starting to be a general acknowledgement that we have to pay attention to that. And we are so vulnerable right now, as far as I'm concerned, with our sophisticated electronics that, yes, makes life easy and wonderful for people, and so much is for entertainment, but it also serves other very useful purposes. But what if everyone's smartphones go down? What if all the computers go down? What if all the satellites are knocked out? What if the electrical system goes down? People won't have water. They won't have transportation. I mean, food distribution, it'll just be absolute chaos. And again, I don't want to be a doomsayer, but I think we need to prepare for that possibility or that eventuality. So we've made ourselves incredibly vulnerable. And not just technologically, but I think a lot of people are very vulnerable, if I could say it, spiritually and philosophically, to deal with the major crisis also. So, I don't know, is it Charles Dickens or something? The best of all worlds and the worst of all worlds, or something like that. I think we're in a very exciting but potentially precarious situation.
Now, the Kali Yuga is, if I understand correctly, is 12,000 years descending, 12,000 years ascending, right?
I've looked into this, and some people say 12,000 years descending, so 12,000 years ascending. If you're looking at it that way, yeah, we could be in the bottom of the Kali Yuga, depending on how you view it. Other people actually put all the Yuga cycles within a 24,000 year period, tying it in with the precessional cycle, where they compact them much shorter. A fellow, well, I mean, he's long deceased, I think it was Sri Yukteswar, put them into a shorter time frame. Actually, something that I have been involved with over the years by attending it, and again, I'm not advocating any particular position here, but there's something known as CPAC, Conference on Precession and Ancient Knowledge, that is hosted by Walter Cruttenden, who is a friend and colleague, and I have a lot of respect for. And he has argued, for instance, for a shorter cycle of yugas, where all the yuga cycle, the entire yuga cycle is gone through in a 24,000 approximately year period, which ties in with the precessional cycle. Precession, for those that aren't familiar with it, I know you are, but for those that aren't familiar with it, is the concept of going through the different ages, like the age of Pisces going into the age of Aquarius, based on where the sun is on the vernal equinox, and that moves very slowly, 1 degree per 72 years. So there's a lot of different things going on in the cosmos. And some people tie recently the Yuga cycle with the precessional cycle, which makes for a much shorter series of yugas than the traditional, which is a much longer time scale. Either way, I think that there are cycles on the order of magnitude of tens of thousands of years. I mentioned the sun, which I think is on a cycle of probably about 12, 13,000 years. And I do believe that there are cycles which are longer term also. So there may, in fact, because it comes from the Hindu, as I understand it, the traditional Hindu writings, there may, in fact, and I'm saying this is Robert Schoch saying this, that there may, in fact, in the traditional scholarship, going back hundreds and thousands of years, actually more than one set of yuga cycles at different scales, where you have the ones that are on the order of magnitude tens of thousands of years, others that are more in the order of magnitude 50 to 100,000 years for the entire cycle. And then there are the grand cycles that really even the ancients from India, the Hindu, basically tradition talks about millions of years and more, which ties in with modern work of how we go around the center of the galaxy. And around the center is probably a black hole, which is giving off really strong electromagnetic signatures, radiation, and maybe super waves, that type of thing, that can affect us periodically. So we have to think in terms of these nested cycles on different periodicities, from daily cycles up to millions and hundreds of millions of years. And if you don't take all of that into account, you're missing something in your analysis.
I think the concept of having cycles nested within cycles makes sense, because even from my vantage point and study of astrology and numerology, there are always cycles inside of cycles. Mm-hmm. And so it makes sense that there could be yuga cycles inside of much larger yuga cycles. Now, some of the theories of the Kaliyuga, which is supposed to be an age of darkness, which would make sense that we've been in something like that for a while now, is that the Kaliyuga ends in 2025. Is that your perception of that?
Oh, no, not at all. I'll be blunt. My perception is that we're going to be in it for a while. 2025 is just around the corner. Now, could something happen on the order of magnitude of 2025? Possibly. And again, I don't want to be a doomsayer, that type of thing, but I think we have to prepare for possibilities, even speaking as a geologist, eventualities, because if things have happened in the past, they're going to happen again. That's a basic maxim of geology. You can't just live in, bliss that, earthquakes don't happen here, volcanoes don't erupt, etc. I sometimes, get, not kick exactly, but I sort of roll my eyes, at least privately, when someone talks about a volcano being extinct because it hasn't erupted for a few thousand years. Well, that's nothing geologically. So we have to pay attention. So could we have something major happen in 2025? Not predicting that, but could that occur? Absolutely. Now, would that be a precipitating factor that could end something like a certain cycle, maybe a Kaliyuga? Possibly. But something that Katie and I talk about is, and I think this is her term, hitting the wall, going through things. And I do think that we're probably in for some major perturbations, some major changes, which aren't necessarily going to be pleasant for at least some people before we move on and enter the next cycle. So could something like that happen within the next decade? I think it's not inconceivable at all. And again, I'm looking at the real science, the real analysis. In 1853, 6 years before the Carrington event in 1859, could people predict that the sun was going to go crazy and erupt? No. Even if they had had the technology that we have today at this very moment, they wouldn't have been able to predict that. We don't understand the astrophysics yet that well in that much detail. It's likewise with earthquakes. We can't really predict earthquakes that well. Although I would point out, and this is very interesting and not conventional thinking, but there's now gathering evidence, more and more evidence that earthquakes and solar activity are correlated, which to me makes sense. It's all one larger scheme, one larger system. Not just a planetary system, but literally solar system, and the planets and the sun are all interacting, and maybe the sun is causing it, or maybe they're all responding to common factors.
Now, are you dating the Mayan civilization to roughly the same time period, about 12,000 years ago?
Yeah, I don't know about the Mayan civilization, and the reason I don't know about the Mayan civilization is that I haven't put enough. I haven't spent enough time focusing and studying on the Mayan civilization, so I'm hesitant to talk about something that I haven't discussed in detail. But what I will say is that I won't be surprised if at least its origins go back to an earlier period than has been suspected. Now, there's a lot of discussion, for instance, of the Mayan calendar and then the 2012, and skeptics in the bunker said, well, 2012 came and went and nothing happened, despite the predictions of some people. I'm not sure we should give up on that so easily, because I'm not sure that we had the correlations exactly correct. That was 2012, and I'm not sure that they were trying to say a precise year and a precise date that something would occur. They may have been talking about more an era, period of, maybe several decades, that this is the time to be looking. Also, as I understand it, their calendar, if you go backwards, it goes back to maybe the 4th millennium or so BC, which is, older than the conventional conventional archaeologists in this case want to date things. And then you go back to a cycle before that once again, and you have the same concept of cycles going back and back and back, just as many other ancient cultures have stated. I have to wonder, did they know something that we don't know? Did they know something more about their own culture and civilization, their own origins, than we do in our hubris? Or when I say we do, when the academics, and I'm an academic, but the orthodox, we'll call it the orthodox or the conventional academics, I'm not convinced that we have all the answers, or that they have all the answers. So I think it's an open question on the Mayans. I wanted to mention Easter Island also, because we started talking about that and I sort of digressed. Easter Island is a fascinating topic. And on Easter Island, you have a lot of, quote, mysteries, and I use that term loosely, but I think it's applicable. You have the huge heads, the moai, the heads and torsos that, really have become emblematic of ancient mysteries, because no one's to this day, no one really quite understands what's going on there. Easter Island is an example where by conventional thinking, it goes back less than 2,000 years. Yet there's been geological data recently that came out looking at sediment cores, that looked at pollen, looked at faunal changes, floral changes on the island, indicating that humans have been on the island much longer than conventional thinking. Not going back to the last ice age yet, but still at least 1,000 or more years earlier than conventional thinking. And when I look at the data, a lot of it stops because that's as far back as the sediment cores that have been analyzed go. And I wonder if some place like Easter Island could go back much, much earlier too. We'll see. Right now, it's a very small island, but that's in part because parts of it have been inundated. They're underwater. When you had the last ice age and, among other things, sea levels rose around the world by incredible amounts, 100 meters in some cases, in some parts, depending on where you were. So vast areas along the coasts or around islands were inundated. So a lot of things are lost when you're talking about the distant past. And you have to recover those, you have to recover the records. But something that ties in with Easter Island, which is very important, is that we have another piece of evidence that there was this major catastrophe and solar outburst at the end of the last ice age. Because one thing you find around the world, and Dr. Anthony Perrott, whom I mentioned before from Los Alamos, has really documented this, he and his colleagues, that when you have a major solar outburst, so this catastrophe from the sun going crazy, you would see things in the sky, which would be very, very dramatic. Everyone, I think, is, if they haven't seen them, they're at least familiar with the northern and southern lights, the aurora borealis. What you would see around the world is, even at low latitudes, not just high latitudes, during major solar outbursts, would be essentially things like the northern lights, but they would be much more definitive, they would be much stronger, and they would actually take on diagnostic shapes, some of which look like stick figures, like sort of dancing people in the sky. Some would look like sort of humanoid stick figures with birds' heads. Some would look like rings, sort of donut rings or cascading rings. And this is documented, even though there was no photography that could capture it. In 1859, even during a small solar outburst, people described seeing these in the sky. And what has been found, particularly by Dr. Perrott, is that around the world, when you look at very ancient engravings on rocks, what are known as petroglyphs, people were carving apparently what they saw in the sky, scratching onto rocks. So when you had a major solar outburst, and this has been documented from 1859, which was very minor relative to such things astrophysically, but during a major solar outburst, you would see essentially what would look like stick figures in the sky, essentially the northern and southern lights, if you think about that, but much more definitive, much more striking. In 1859, during the solar outburst at that time, which, as I said, was relatively minor, but would devastate our modern society if it occurred again, people saw what they described as dancing figures in the sky. You would also see what would look like stick figures with birds' heads, or stick figures with sort of like multiple arms or donuts on their sides. So these are very diagnostic shapes, cascading, cylindrical shapes. And Dr. Perrott has documented, he and his colleagues have documented over 130 countries, ancient petroglyphs that are showing these diagnostic shapes. And in fact, he's also been able to document that what he calls the field of view, they were all looking towards the same part of the sky where this major solar outburst came in. So it's very powerful evidence. On Easter Island, we have petroglyphs that seem to relate to the same phenomenon, but something else preserved on Easter Island is the Rongo-Rongo script. This is known as the only Polynesian writing, the only indigenous Polynesian writing. It's generally been interpreted as hieroglyphs, but no one's been able to translate it as, you would a normal language. And something, and I give credit where credit is due, that Katie, my wife, first pointed out to me and brought to my attention is that the Rongo-Rongo looks just like the petroglyphs and just like the plasma configurations you would see in the sky during a major solar outburst. So what we now believe is the case is that the Rongo-Rongo, which is carved onto wooden tablets, and the wooden tablets are not that old, but like any manuscript or record like that, they are copies of copies of copies of copies of copies going way back, as the Easter Islanders, the Rapa Nui, have stated. And what we believe is that this is another record of what was happening in that long ago catastrophic time, what people were seeing in the sky. And maybe even they were trying to record precisely what the indications would be when you had a major catastrophe like this, when you had major solar outbursts. What will you start to see in the sky when you know that you better seek shelter and prepare yourself? So some of this information, if we could understand it carefully and put it into modern terms, could be actually of great practical value. So that's another avenue that I've been looking at. So I love ancient cultures and ancient civilizations just for their own sake, but I think we have a lot to learn from them, be it spiritual, philosophical, or even how to prepare to live in the world that we face, to live in our environment. And this ties back to the cycles and things like the precessional cycle or the Yuga cycles, something that I feel we have lost. Generally, I mean, people like you and I and your listeners maybe haven't lost this completely, but the general society seems to be very short-term. Society in general, 100 years is a long time. 1,000 years is a really long time. What I find when you look at ancient beliefs and ancient systems and ancient cultures, they were thinking, yes, of course, in the short term, because you have to from a practical point of view, but they were also thinking in the long term, and they were recording in the long term, and they realized that there were these longer cycles. And that, I think, is a very important lesson that we need to relearn.
Now, a lot of people have gone in search of Atlantis, and I know you've read of some of Edgar Cayce's work about Atlantis, and also the Hall of Records underneath the Sphinx. And now, do you think Atlantis was a single physical continent, or is it a story that's really more illustrative of the end of the Ice Age and all of the various ancient civilizations that were submerged during that time?
Yeah, I actually, this is a good point. I'm glad you brought this up. And I've spoken a couple of times at the ARE, Association for the Research and Enlightenment, the Edgar Cayce's ARE. And I don't know if you realize this, and I didn't mention it before, but when we did seismic studies around the Sphinx, Thomas DeBecke and I did that back in the early 1990s. Among other things, we found a chamber under the left paw of the Sphinx, which to this day has not been, to my knowledge, because there's all these rumors that go around, but to my knowledge has not been entered, has not been excavated. This is something I would like to do. But we found that in the early 1990s. We published that in the scientific literature as well as it was popularized. And I got a call from the Edgar Cayce Foundation. I actually spoke to Edgar Cayce's son, who was still alive at the time, one of his sons who was still alive at the time. I think it was Edgar Evans Cayce. I hope I got that right. He's now deceased. And he told me that I had found potentially the Hall of Records that his father had predicted was in the vicinity of the Great Sphinx. And in fact, when you go, I didn't know let me put it this way. I had heard the name Edgar Cayce because I was well read and I knew a little bit about Edgar Cayce. But at the time, I did not know that Edgar Cayce had predicted a Hall of Records in anywhere close to the Sphinx. I wasn't really familiar with all of Edgar Cayce's work on Atlantis or his channeling or his I shouldn't say prophecies, his retro-prophecies, retrocognition about Atlantis and what had happened. So I was not, as some people in academia have accused me of, trying to find or prove anything about Edgar Cayce because I have no vested interest in Edgar Cayce. But it's pretty interesting that he made these predictions and we found that chamber, which, yeah, it could be the Hall of Records. I mean, there are many people that believe it could be the Hall of Records that Edgar Cayce had predicted, which hold records of what he referred to as Atlantis. And this brings up the whole thorny issue of Atlantis. I say thorny because I now am talking to you about Atlantis. 20 years ago, I don't think I would have been, because I went through a period in the 90s in particular where I would not say the word Atlantis in public, because it was so charged among academics that if you were looking for Atlantis or associated with Atlantis, you could not be a valid, scientist, that type of thing. Now I'm more open about it because I think we have to be open to the possibilities. In answer to your question about my view of Atlantis, I don't see Atlantis, or I'm not interested, should we put it that way. Everyone has to have their interest. You can't, I wish I could live forever and pursue all my interests, but I have to focus a little bit. My focus right now is not on Atlantis as a specific geographic locality, and I don't interpret it that way. I could be wrong, but I don't interpret it that way. I interpret it more the latter way you suggested, which is that it's indicative of an early cycle of civilization, this what I call the pre-ice age, pre-end of the last ice age cycle of civilization. So I see it more as temporal, and that I don't take Plato at his word. I believe Plato's word that we mentioned before, that Atlantis went down about 9600 or so BC, makes absolute sense with the data that we're accumulating, that there was this earlier cycle of civilization that collapsed catastrophically at the end of the last ice age. So I believe, and I talk about this in my book, Forgotten Civilization, I believe that Plato's concept and recounting of Atlantis fits in with the science that we are now pursuing as to this early cycle of civilization and exactly what happened to it. Now, is it possible that there was Atlantis in a specific locality that was representative of this broader concept of civilization on Earth at that time? Yes, but like I said, that my personal interest is not to find, quote, the city of Atlantis or the capital of Atlantis. I'm more interested in looking at the concept of civilization, the evidence for that at that remote period.
Now, have you ever been diving in off the coast of Bimini where Cayce predicted Atlantis would be?
No, I actually never have. I've never had, I came close to it a couple of times, but then things fell through or whatnot. So I've actually never been to Bimini. I've never dived there. I have dived other places. I should mention, since you brought it up, I've been to Yonaguni. Are you familiar with that? Yonaguni, yes. Off the coast of, it's off the coast of Yonaguni, which is a little island, part of the Ryukyus, part of Japan. And there's an underwater structure that some people have tied not to Atlantis, but sort of the Pacific version, Mu or Lemuria. And I've got to say, because people argue with me about this, but I've been there, I want to say 4 times, dived it numerous times. There are really interesting structures there, and there's evidence of ancient civilization on the island that I think goes back to this very early period. And the latest data is that there actually was a land bridge from Yonaguni to Taiwan, because you can see to this day Taiwan on a clear day from Yonaguni, from the tip of Yonaguni, you can look and see Taiwan in the distance. And there's known to be very early cultural remains on Taiwan, again, going back to the last ice age. So I think there was interchange there. There's this incredible underwater structure that would have been above water at the end of the last ice age off the coast of Yonaguni. The catch is that I believe I'm talking as a geologist, most of the underwater Yonaguni structure is natural, not artificial, not man-made, but there is certainly evidence that it was being utilized by humans, that humans were on the island, and it may have been, maybe a small percentage of it sort of touched up or reworked by human activity. But I do think most of it's natural. But to me, that doesn't detract from the beauty of it or the significance. Or if you think about the Far East to this day, they relish and they cherish natural features and they venerate them. And I think we have a very long tradition going back 12,000 years or more in this area where sacred sites can be sacred sites even if they're completely natural. But then they're visited, they're used, they're utilized. And I think we may have evidence of that at Yonaguni. So I do think it ties in. Also in the Far East, there's a site that Katie and I have had a chance to visit, and that's Gunung Padang on it's West Java, on the island of Java in Indonesia. And this is a site that is being studied by the geophysicist. He's a Ph.D. geophysicist, Danny Hillman. I think his correct name in Indonesian name is Danny Hillman Natawajaya. I think I got it right, but he goes by Danny Hillman. And he is an Indonesian, but he's an American-trained Ph.D. geophysicist. And the site of Gunung Padang, which I've had the opportunity to visit, is, I'm convinced, another sophisticated site. It looks sort of like rubble on the surface, but you have to understand the site, and he's done geophysical work there, and he's got radiocarbon dates that goes back to the end of the last ice age. And I believe it's part of this larger cycle of sophisticated culture, sophisticated civilization that was decimated in 9700 BC at the end of the last ice age. And I mentioned that one way for people to escape would be to go underground into caves, into shelters. And we see that around the world, including in Indonesia. He has documented geophysically that apparently there's a cavity or chamber within the site and an entrance, a tunnel entrance that goes to the surface. It hasn't been excavated yet. And as far as I can determine from his data, that entrance, that tunnel, was sealed off about 9700 or so BC at the end of the last ice age. So again, it's one more piece of the puzzle, I think, that fits in with this bigger picture.
So meaning it's sealed off and no one's excavated in there yet?
No one's excavated yet. In fact, this is part of the problem. And I have hit this roadblock, if we would, for over two and a half decades, where when you start talking about these unconventional from the orthodox point of view, I mean, this is paradigm changing. The standard paradigm is that civilization arose for the first and only time about 3500 BC or more or less. Before that, we were hunter-gatherers, we were barbarians, we were primitive, and there's been a one-way set of progress. This is a standard academic view, with the emergence of civilization and getting more and more and more sophisticated, leading up ultimately, with a few fluctuations, a little dark age after the fall of the Roman Empire. But basically, we're getting more sophisticated up to modern technological society, and that we have gotten exponentially more sophisticated, at least technologically. And we see that in the last century and a half or so. At least I'm old enough, I can imagine, I remember the days before the internet and everyone's cell phones and, all this type of stuff. I mean, we are really progressing technologically, if not spiritually and philosophically. scientifically. But there is this concept of one-way progression, and to talk about civilization having existed before civilization is supposed to have existed according to standard academic orthodox thinking, and to have been back at the end of the last ice age 6,000 years or more earlier than civilization is supposed to have existed, and then to have collapsed and have gone for extended dark age, something that Katie and I and other people are starting to now call SIDA, SIDA, which stands for solar-induced dark age, which is sort of ironic. Solar-induced, the sun is inducing a dark age, but that's exactly what happened. To talk about that, and to talk about now this earlier cycle, which starts, when I talk about this among certain academics, the next thing that they're talking, I must be some kind of religious nut because I must be talking about, Hindu Yuga cycles, which we mentioned, and they see that as just purely religious or metaphorical. So there's all this resistance to even thinking about this, or looking at the evidence, or developing the evidence. And even in Indonesia, as I understand the political situation, there are a lot of people that want him to stop the research. They don't want to see excavations done. And the way I would put it is that psychologically or emotionally, whatever, they don't want their paradigm destroyed. They don't want their way of thinking changed. They don't want new evidence developed that might question their worldview. And I find this quite a bit in many circles. Literally people say, I don't want to hear about it. I know what I believe, and that's the way it is. And people are resistant to changing their thought patterns, especially if it has real practical implications for the future. I mean, a lot of people rather, and I use this in the colloquial term, live in sort of naive bliss, ignorance. What did they say? Ignorance is bliss for some people, and they don't want to face either changing their views on things or the potential implications.
And when you did your research in under the paw of the Sphinx, I think you found that there was something actually in the cavity, right? It was rectangular shaped, and there was evidence of something being.
Yeah, it's rectangular shaped. It's fairly major. I want to say off the top of my head, maybe 9 by 12 meters, maybe 5 meters below the current bedrock surface. And it has a resonance or ringing or indicative seismically that, yes, there's something in it, that it's not empty. And I suspect there's something in it that is important to us that we should look at. Now, the naysayers can say, maybe the roof caved in and that's all you're picking up. Well, possibly, partly that could be the case. But no, I think the indications are, and the expectation would be that, yes, there's something in there that we should find it. I mean, look at all the hubbub and excitement with Tutankhamun's tomb back in the 1920s or so. I think, we have a potentially very exciting discovery with the chamber under the paws. And, if someone like Edgar Cayce was right, and it is a hall of records, who knows how important it could be. So this is something I've been wanting to pursue for a quarter century now. And I'm hoping, honestly, what do they say? Keep one's fingers crossed that with the new regime in Egypt, Egypt has gone through political turmoil, and it's gone through the revolution, the counter-revolution, with sort of the change and shake-up in Egypt. And tourism is really down. I was in Egypt a couple of times this summer. I would go back and forth to Egypt for the research and to visit. And they're very dependent on tourism. What could be better than opening a chamber under the paw of the Sphinx and finding some incredible information or artifacts or both for tourism and to attract people back to Egypt? So, maybe practicality and politics will work in our favor at this point. I don't know. I'm trying to be positive. See what happens.
Are you seeing any sort of progress in conventional academic archaeology in terms of them being more open-minded and willing to consider these alternative viewpoints?
Yeah, I think so. At conferences I've been to, I've had more, should we say, positive comments from people I didn't necessarily expect the positive comments from. A lot of it, unfortunately, is still behind the scenes, more privately than publicly, because it's this mentality. And I understand it because it can be very cutthroat in academia, like I guess any field, and people don't want to stick their necks out. So they'll sometimes be much more sympathetic, much more open to things privately, but they won't necessarily do it publicly because they're waiting for everyone else to do it. And then everyone else is waiting for everyone else. So you get this vicious cycle. But yes, I think so. In 1992, let me put it this way. In 1992, and I mentioned this briefly before, American Association for the Advancement of Science had this debate on the age of the Sphinx, where in hindsight, I realized it was simply to put me down and try to shut me up and destroy me, at least from the perspective of talking about this crazy nonsense of the Sphinx being older. And I can sort of see in hindsight why Egyptologists, archaeologists, and historians were very skeptical about it. But as I said, so much has developed since, especially with the development or the excavation of Göbekli Tepe and the dating of that, and very strong evidence, very, I think, incontrovertible evidence that we do have civilization going back this much further. That, and this is maybe all I can hope for from some of my former critics, a lot of them are now being quiet. So I don't get the venom. I don't get the criticism that I used to get publicly from them. Now, many people who are not in academia have said to me or written to me by email and asked, have they apologized to you? It doesn't work that way. At least that's my experience. No, none of my critics have come up and apologized, say, well, I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry all the nasty things I said about you 20, 25 years ago. Turns out you're right after all. I haven't quite had that yet. But sometimes silence, is good. That at least they're starting to, accept things. And a lot of it too, and this is sort of a cliche, but often in academia or in other fields, it's not so much that you convert the critics, convert the naysayers, but essentially, and I hate to use the term die, but they die. Now, not necessarily literally, but they retire, they no longer become influential, and a new generation takes their place that doesn't have the same preconceptions, that doesn't abide by the same dogma, that's more open to changing the paradigm or was not so invested in that paradigm. And I very much see that now because we're essentially talking a generation since I first started this 25, 26 years ago. So I'm seeing a much more openness, I'll put it that way, much more openness in the upcoming generation. For instance, I've had cases where people have written dissertations. I remember one dissertation I was sent, a Ph.D. dissertation, and it was sent to me with the comment electronically saying, oh, you're mentioned in this. Your work on the Sphinx is mentioned in this. And I couldn't help but think, oh no, it's probably to go after me. It's probably to try to put me down, etc. No, it was just accepting, mentioning my work on the Sphinx and that I've redated the Sphinx and that civilization goes back much earlier. And it wasn't just the person writing the dissertation, but his committee members, all PhD faculty members, had to sign off on this, and they had all signed off on it. And so it's starting to become, we'll say, more mainstream, perhaps, or more acceptable. That it can be cited, it can be used by other people, this information to build upon. So I think that's good. So yes, we're seeing the change. But look, other scientific revolutions in the past, sometimes they happen seemingly overnight. In other cases, it takes a very long time to make the mainstream. No, I'm hopeful that I'll see, and hopefully I'm already seeing it. I think I'm already seeing it in my lifetime. I don't want to be one of these guys that, you know, they're vilified during their lifetime and then praised long after they passed away.
I had Brian Forrester on my show recently, and I know you're friends with him, right?
Yeah, I know him well, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now, Brian's done a lot more work in studying some of the elongated skulls and such of other potentially different races of beings that have existed on Earth at one point. I know you're primarily a geologist, but do you have any opinion on who actually built these ancient sites? Were they, and I know there's no evidence really that you found that supports extraterrestrials, but do you envision them as being some sort of more advanced humanoid race that once existed on Earth and no longer does, or do you have any thoughts on that?
No, that's a tricky question. I don't really know. Are there legends? Are there suggestions, for instance, of giants around? Yeah, these keep circulating, but I've got to say there's a lot of evidence that is really not evidence. And a lot of people that misinterpret things, be it giants or elongated skulls or anything else. And you have to remember, I am trained in part as an anthropologist, and a good chunk of that's physical anthropology. I'm trained in comparative vertebrate anatomy, and there is a lot of flexibility and a lot of, possibilities when you're talking about skeletal anatomy. But on the other hand, what we're finding, and I think this is pertinent to the topic, is that in physical anthropology, in human evolution, we are actually, for the last 10,000, 12,000 years, maybe shorter than that, but the evidence is, equivocal. It's a strange time on Earth in the sense that we have, to the best of our knowledge, only one species of human on Earth. Most of the duration, I'm talking geologically, for the last 2 million years or so, there was more than one species of human on Earth for most of the time, and many time frames, many slices of time. If you go back 50, 100,000 years or more, you had several species of human on Earth. And I like one example. It's not on the giant side, it's on the diminutive side. I'm sure you've heard of the hobbits, Homo floresiensis. They were found a few years ago, or some years ago, I forget which year, but early 2000s, early 21st century. And at first it was thought to be a hoax because they were these little teeny skeletons, but adult skeletons, perfectly formed heads and brains. They actually made they were associated with little tiny stone tools. They were found in Indonesia on the island of Flores. And they were also, from a geological perspective, very, very recent. You were talking just the end of the last ice age. So, only for the most recent ones, maybe 12,000 years ago or so. And interestingly, there were legends, particularly from the Dutch traders in the Dutch East Indies, about how the local people had talked about a race or a species of little people who lived up in the hills, isolated, would sometimes come down and raid the villages. And, this was just dismissed as total nonsense until Homo floresiensis, commonly known as the hobbits, because they only stood maybe 3 or 3.5 feet tall at the most, were found in their fossils, their subfossils, I should say, as a geologist, because they're not that old, were found. And it turns out, yet after much controversy, almost all paleontologists and archaeologists and physical anthropologists now agree that, yes, this was a distinct, separate species of humans from us that lived so incredibly recently. So, could they have even survived up until historical times? Based on the legends, based on the information that was passed down, which maybe we should not dismiss so easily, that's a possibility. So could there be other species that survived until when I say recent times, I'm talking geologically, at least the end of the last ice age, that were not us, that maybe we're more intelligent in some ways or more sophisticated. I don't want to exclude that possibility. But I also think that we have to realize that we as humans, look at what we accomplish now with our technology. I mean, we are very, very intelligent, and there's no indication whatsoever that people in the last 100 to 200,000 years, last 200,000 years, and I'm not being mistaken in my terms, had just as big brains, were just as sophisticated mentally. That doesn't mean they were making technology like us, but it doesn't mean that they were untechnological either. And something that I sometimes grapple with when I look at these huge megalithic stone structures and I ponder how could they build them, what technology they were using. Often my colleagues think in terms of our technology. Did they have power tools like us? Were they doing things like us? And I sometimes say back off and say, maybe we have to think in different terms. Were they doing things with technology that is totally different than what we're using and has been lost? I mean, were they accomplishing things not by using our type of technology, but something that we can't imagine at the moment because it's been completely lost and has not been rediscovered or reinvented? And I don't think that's outside the realm of possibilities either, that there are possibilities out there that we frankly don't imagine. Not just that we have a hard time imagining them, but we don't imagine because they're so different than what we're used to, that we can't take these ancient cultures and sort of put them into our mold and think that they were using technologies or they were thinking like us philosophically, that the same things that are important to us were important to them. So not to pick on anyone, but I'll use one example, the Great Pyramid. Why do you build the Great Pyramid? There are some people out there that insist that if they put all this time and energy into building the Great Pyramid, it must have some kind of, quote, practical function, more or less practical from our sense. That must have been, for refining ores or as a power plant or as a water pump, some very pragmatic function. But maybe it had a function that's totally different than anything we're thinking about. And I suspect that, in fact, might be the case. And likewise, when it comes to technologies, how they did some of these things, maybe they were using technologies that are just so different from what we're using and what we're familiar with that it's essentially unfathomable. We can't fathom it at the moment. We can't imagine it at the moment. We can't, as they say, wrap our heads around it at the moment. So I think we have to be careful not to try to put ancient peoples and ancient cultures and ancient civilizations, sort of force them into our framework of thinking.
Now we're going to have you at our Awaken Empowered Expo just in a couple of weeks here in November 4th, 5th, and 6th in Detroit. And can you talk a bit about what you're going to be covering during your presentation there?
Oh, I want to say thank you for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to it. You and I have talked about it over the phone and whatnot, and I think it's going to be a fabulous expo. So Katie and I are really looking forward to it. And what I'd like to talk about are some of the topics we've touched on in this discussion and elaborate on them further. I'll be giving a presentation. I have lots of, I'm known, I think, for my slides, my PowerPoint slides, and lots of photographs to illustrate what I'm talking about. I'd like to talk about this whole early cycle of civilization and illustrate that, and really make the case visually as well as verbally for that. I'll also touch, I think, probably on some of the ancient belief systems and thoughts that I think tie right in with modern scientific developments and techniques that we're just rediscovering. So I see myself, I am a scientist. I'm a strict academic science scientists, but I think we have to tie that in with things like spirituality and a deep philosophical basis. And this is something I think the ancients were doing, and I'll talk about that a little bit. For instance, I might talk a little bit about actually something that Katie has gotten me thinking about and really initiated, and that is the concept of where do we go when we cease this bodily existence? You know, ancient Egyptians, for instance, thought that we go to become stars in the sky, or at least that there was a possibility that we could become stars in the sky. And she has developed the theory, which I've been working on further, that, yeah, there's probably a real scientific basis for such types of beliefs, that this was just not just sort of this metaphorical woo-woo, as some of my colleagues say. Or, you know, I find it amazing that people, and this is the conventional academic point of view, amazing that someone can study, and I'll use Egyptology as an example, not to pick on them, but they can study the ancient Egyptians all their career to simply come to the conclusion that these were fascinating people, but frankly pretty stupid and dumb. Yes, they made great art and they could build the Great Pyramid and we won't bother. I'm saying they say this, not me. They won't bother trying to explain how could they build the Great Pyramid. They can't quite answer that question, but they know they did because it's there and you can't deny it. But they'll still come to the conclusion that these were basically a stupid, primitive people relative to us. And I think that's a very false conclusion. I think we have a lot to learn from the ancients, and I can't imagine studying something as sophisticated as ancient Egypt, because to me it's evidently they were quite sophisticated, even if we don't quite understand everything they were trying to we don't understand everything they were doing or everything that they understood or they were maybe trying to communicate to us, but they certainly weren't primitive. And in many cases, I think that they had a deeper knowledge and understanding of certain aspects than we do to this day, if we could just interpret or reinterpret what they have to say to us.
So can you elaborate on yours and Katie's theories on what happens after the physical embodiment ends?
Oh, well, something that's very interesting. Katie, we actually met about this. This is one of the first things she actually caught my attention when we met years ago. She had the concept that hydrogen may be instrumental in our physical and spiritual being. Now, hydrogen, okay, you can say, well, what is hydrogen? What does hydrogen have to do with anything? But think about hydrogen at a atomic level and a quantum level. It's basically protons and electrons, simplest substance. Many people think of it that pervades the universe, but it has all kinds of properties. It can encode information. What are we? We're primarily hydrogen when it comes right down to it at atomic level between water and organic molecules. What are stars? They're primarily hydrogen. And there's lots of evidence that hydrogen can encode information. It can potentially store information. If you look at from a I'm really simplifying here, but if you look at it from a quantum physical point of view, what happens to atoms when they are associated with each other in intimate relationships, say an organic being or body, they get entangled, and they can keep that entanglement, they can keep those connections potentially after the dissolution of the physical body. So to make a long story short, there's a possibility that maybe hydrogen and other, maybe the subatomic particles within hydrogen can actually encode information, can relay information, can sustain information, and this may persist after our dissolution. It may be one way that personality, human, not physical bodies, but personalities, what people might call soul, that type of thing, persists after the fact. And what are stars? They are collections of hydrogen. There's more and more evidence that stars, I was at a conference recently where another speaker was propounding the concept, which is not new to him, that stars at a fundamental level have what we could call consciousness. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that everything has consciousness at a certain level. And interestingly, if our hydrogen escapes from us when we die, and this is Katie's, I have to give Katie credit for this, it's light, it floats up so it could collect. And she actually came to first think about this, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting her, but we can talk about this more at the conference, the concept of hydrogen collecting as gas clouds collapsing, forming stars. So is there something physically to forming stars from hydrogen and other constituent particles, very light elements, but that they would keep an entanglement together, keep, we'll call it personality together, people want to call it soul together. And one aspect of this, which I find fascinating, is that when you look at cultures around the world, and the Egyptians were very adamant about this, but lots of other cultures are too, they talk about what I'll call soul components, or psychic components that you have to keep together. You have to keep these fragments together if you're going to continue into, we'll call it the afterlife or the beyond. And that's important to have integrity between these. And this would tie right in with the concept of some kind of particle like hydrogen encoding information, but having to be in contact, entangled, to use more quantum physical term, to have a persistence over time. I don't know if any of that makes sense, because it's hard to explain these things. But I'm convinced that there is something to this in a real physical sense. I want to give a couple of examples. For instance, a lot of people know about the work of the late professor, I pronounce it correctly, Emoto. Did I get that right? Emoto, on water and how it can encode information, can respond. Well, what is water? It's primarily hydrogen. There's been work that water itself, primarily hydrogen, can encode information all on its own without anything else being in it. Some people have argued that, for instance, this is the basis of homeopathy, homeopathic solutions, which essentially are water, and have dilutions, supposed dilutions that are so weak that chemically you can't detect anything else in them, yet they still carry information, important information. So I think these are all parts of this puzzle, that we are developing a physical mechanism as to why there can be this persistence of information, of consciousness. That's a word I want to use. Consciousness, of personality, of continuation. And this is now starting to be taken very seriously, not just in, general, among certain people in the general populace. Maybe, I'm sure people at the expo will be interested in this, but also, or I hope they will be, but also in academic circles, certain academic circles. One quote I sometimes use, and I'm not going to try to quote it directly now, but Max Planck, the Nobel Prize winner and the founder of quantum physics, is quoted as saying, and this is absolutely on the record, that he thought ultimately consciousness is fundamental to everything, that it underlies everything else. And that, one of the implications potentially is that you can find these connections and ultimately find, trying to get at the root of what consciousness is, and it's really, has to do with information and encoding information.
Along the lines of that theory that you and Katie came up with, do you have an explanation for past life experiences or past life memories, or even the concept of karma?
Yeah, and because in fact, if you're encoding this information and it's persisting, one thing that and I'm speaking for myself at the moment, because I don't want to, let me put it this way. One person said to me, well, could this explain the Akashic record? The concept of the Akashic record, that you are encoding information, it is persisting, and then that would be information that could be tapped into. So what is a past life experience, or what is reincarnation? Is it literally, and this gets into a fuzzy area, because what is literally the consciousness? What literally is the person? If you're tapping into a record and you're getting all the memories, or a series of memories, say from another individual personality, are you now that personality? Are you a reincarnation, or are you just picking up information, or is there a fuzzy gray area? You see where I'm going with this? You know, and it could explain a lot of things. And some people may have very strong, we'll call it past life experiences, but they're tapping into this information which still exists, still persists, and that they can, we'll use the term, become entangled with, or perceptive to. So yeah, again, you know, this is on the cutting edge and it's still being developed, but I think it could very well start to explain certain things. And this is something that's important to me as a scientist and as a physical scientist, is to take these experiences that people have, not simply dismiss them as nonsense, but look at them and start to try to figure out, well, how could this be? What could be going on? How could we explain this?
Now, you'll also be doing some book signings at the expo as well. You've written quite a few books. What's the most recent one that you're bringing?
The most recent one, and the one that I recommend to everyone, is Forgotten Civilization. It's called Forgotten Civilization, The Role of Solar Outbursts in Our Past and Future. The Role of Solar Outbursts in Our Past and Future. So from the title, you might gather that two of the major themes in the book are forgotten civilization, that is, looking at this earlier cycle of civilization, and I talk about my work on the Great Sphinx in some depth, and I talk about Göbekli Tepe and what's going on with that, and I talk about the end of the last ice age, things that we've been discussing during the last hour or so. And I also look at solar outbursts and what the future prospects may be, which I know for some people is scary, but I think we have to look at the evidence as we see it. And in that book also, I have a final chapter where I talk about some of the new science, as I call it, the new developments that seem to correlate with ancient wisdom, ancient discoveries, and the version of what we were just talking about, Katie's theory, is included in the book too. Something, though, that we're continuing to develop, continuing to refine, and, you know, present further. But a summary of that is in the book as well. So I think it's a great book. I mean, I'm not trying to say that just because I wrote it, but the point is that there's a lot of important information, I think, that has to get out. And I try to pull a lot of things together for the reader. So not just one isolated topic, but really tying things together. And, that's the book I would recommend for people to start with.
Now, for people who may not be familiar with your work, I'm sure most of the viewers of this show are, but where would they find your books and your events, or get in touch with you?
Okay, well, the best thing for books is to go to Amazon, but you can do that through my website. You can contact me through the website, and my website is www.robertschoch, all one word, and spelled Robert, and my last name is schoch.com. So www.robertschoch.com. And I want to say it again, my last name is schoch. And I stress that because for many people, it's not spelled the way it sounds. They want to put a K on the end, but it's schoch. So people can go there. Ooh, excuse me. People can go there. They can get links to my books, in particular Forgotten Civilization. They can see of course, a link to the expo, which I'm really excited to speak at. I do trips. I take people on trips to some of these sites. Sometimes I travel alone, or Katie and I just travel alone because it's primarily research, but we also do trips where we take people with us. We've got one planned for Malta. We've got another one planned for Peru, Bolivia, and Easter Island. So we're very excited about that. And people can either come to Easter Island and not do Peru and Bolivia, or vice versa, or the whole thing. The other thing I wanted to mention, and there's a link from my website, is Oracle, Organization for the Research of Ancient Cultures. And this is a new nonprofit that myself and Katie and some colleagues are putting together. Organization for the Research of Ancient Cultures. Like I said, nonprofit. We've done all the bureaucratic paperwork, so we're legitimate, we're real, and what we want to do is not just raise money, but raise awareness for this type of research and be able to have an avenue and a venue to pursue it. Because as we've been talking about, much of this is somewhat non-conventional, if we can put it that way. It is going against the standard paradigm. So it's difficult. You can't, some of this, you're not just going to apply to the normal government funding agencies, because they're going to turn you down because it doesn't go with their agenda. It doesn't follow their agenda. So for many cutting edge things, you have to have outside ways to approach this. So this is one of the things that we're doing. For instance, to go back to Egypt, ultimately, I'd like to get into the chamber under the paws of the Sphinx. Or I've got a research project I would love to do around the coast of Easter Island to see what is in the waters there. There's evidence, there's suggestions that there may be quarries that are now deeply submerged, but were, above water at the end of the last ice age. That would show definitively that the history of the island goes back much earlier if we could find that. So there's a lot of important information to pursue there. I've got an article up on that website, as well as articles on my own website. So again, I would recommend that people go to www.robertschoch, S-C-H-O-C-H, robertschoch.com, and we've got links there. And if people want to contact me, if you scroll down to the very bottom of the web page, you'll actually see Katie's email, and just send a note to Katie and she forwards everything to me. We do it that way because I'm just so, between being a full-time academic, full-time faculty member, teaching, etc., I get swamped on my Boston University email. Although if people want to email me directly, you can look me up at Boston University. I'm a faculty member there, and if you go to the Boston University website, people can look me up also. But I suggest my website is the place to start.
Now, to sum up our entire conversation today, we were talking largely about these ancient civilizations and the various grand cycles and how it relates to really this precise time that we're standing in right now as a pivotal turning point in some direction. And it sounds like, based on wherever we are in the Kaliyuga, which is an age of darkness, that's where we are. But obviously, if that's where we've been, we're about to shift into something else. Whether it's more of the Kaliyuga or not is hard to say. But I'm curious because, well, the existence of our whole expo and the whole movement that we're working on here, and we're seeing so much of this happening in the world right now, even in the various discoveries in archaeology, it seems to me, with the pulse that I have my hand on these days, that there is a huge awakening happening in the world in consciousness, and so many people coming into very extraordinary gifts, and even our understanding in various breakthroughs in science, technology, 3D printing, the internet. We are obviously at a very significant point in the evolution of the human civilization and consciousness. So I'm wondering, is there any chance you think that maybe this solar outburst that we're starting to see some evidence of now, which obviously also have an effect on the human brain and could potentially unlock genetic qualities that have been dormant, that I'm wondering, do you think that there's any chance that this particular period of evolution that's occurring with the solar outbursts that potentially are happening now, or super wave, or whatever we want to call it, that we could be heading into an age of higher consciousness and enlightenment, not necessarily destruction like the last ice age?
I don't think that the two are incompatible. I mean, you're sort of setting it up, and I know this may not be a popular view, but I've thought about this quite a bit, and I don't know that's necessarily one or the other. In fact, some discussions I've had with people, one might conclude that we are in a time where, in a sense, you have this dichotomy. Yes, you have a developing higher consciousness among certain sectors of the population. Yes, you have this incredible technology, but as I mentioned before, we're also incredibly vulnerable among certain groups of the population. I'm not trying to point fingers to anyone, but I think we have a real lack of spirituality and philosophical depth. And we may have, and I tend to think this way, so, and again, I'm not trying to be a doomsayer, but my feeling is that we are potentially going to go through something fairly catastrophic, and that it could have a very strong negative effect on some aspects of our society, of our culture, of our world. It could have perhaps a cleansing effect, if I put it that way. And I don't wish ill or destruction or anything on anyone, but I'm looking realistically at it and at the evidence, and I think that we could have both effectively. There could be a major catastrophe, and I'm not saying right away, but there could be flowering after that. And maybe it's a really crude analogy, and I should not bring it up, but I was actually mentioning this to Katie, the thought that came into my head the other day, and it may not be legitimate at all, but it's a very small scale thing compared to what we might be talking about. But in the 14th century, you had the plague and the Black Death, and it was devastating, absolutely devastating. But what did you have following on the heels of that? Effectively, the beginning of the Renaissance and a very changed world and worldview. And I use that just as a very crude analogy. But my point is that I don't necessarily see it as one or the other. In fact, I think we're in a time of turmoil at many levels, and both are involved. Both are involved. So I said before, I think we're in the Kaliyuga, in that, how should we say, there's scary things or there's dramatic things coming. But ultimately, once we get through it, or the portion of those that get through it, and I'm not even thinking just humans, but, the earth, the earth as a whole. Once we get beyond that, there could be major flowering. I hope that there would be, something really upbeat after that. So I don't see it as either or. I think there's actually very strong elements of both involved. And we're in what's I think Katie said to me, it's a Chinese saying, we're in exciting times, dramatic times. No, I sort of, I don't want to sound the wrong way, but I sort of like being in exciting times. I think it is a very dramatic time. There's a lot happening, and I think there will be a lot happening. And, I have mixed feelings about it, but I want to see what happens.
So a period of darkness before we head into a period of light, basically. Yeah, exactly. Isn't there some cliche about it's darkest just before the dawn or something like that? I don't know. I'm not into cliches, but yes, I think both aspects are applicable at the moment. Now, do you think that this effect, the solar bursts and such, have a multidimensional impact, or just in our
Oh
physical
yeah,
three-dimensional?
you were just yeah, no, you were just mentioning that was another aspect of what you were just mentioning, which I distracted myself. There is no doubt in my mind right now, based on very strong evidence, that scientific evidence that solar activity, solar changes, a solar outburst, I think it could in fact have a very strong consciousness component, emotional component affecting us. Uh, that, different, especially alphas, they call it extremely low frequency, long wavelength changes. So if people are familiar with Schumann resonances, I don't want to get into that now, but just sort of let people take my word for it. These are extremely low frequency, long wavelength magnetic waves, electromagnetic radiation that circles the Earth. This is affected by solar activity because it changes the ionosphere, etc. And we are susceptible to that. It affects us consciousness-wise. It affects us emotionally. Geomagnetic fluctuations and something that is associated with solar activity are what are known as geomagnetic storms. And there's lots of experimental and evidence and correlations with field studies that geomagnetic fluctuations, changes in the geomagnetic field, affect people's consciousness, affect people's emotions, affect people's psychic abilities. So these are very real. So if we're going through a major solar outburst in the future, not only is it going to have all kinds of physical changes occurring on Earth as a result, crude physical changes from earthquakes to torrential rains to, you name it. It's also going to affect, I believe, our consciousness, our emotions, our abilities, mental abilities. Now, exactly how that's going to affect it, I don't know, especially when you've got wild fluctuations, which will probably occur. Could there be a winnowing effect? Could ultimately some of it, have should we say positive aspects? I hope that might be the case. I just don't know. I don't think we know enough about it. It may be, and I don't want to sound the wrong way, it may be wishful thinking to think that all of a sudden this is just going to raise all our consciousness. But maybe it will, or maybe it will be a winnowing effect. That's for some people that survive through it, it does raise their consciousness to a higher level. Again, tying back to what I was saying before, that I see this as not this or that, not either or, but a combination of factors.
Great. Well, it's been a pleasure having you on my show, and I'm looking forward to meeting you and Katie in person very soon. And so have a safe flight, and I'll see you really soon.
Yes, we're very much looking forward to it. It'll be great to meet and discuss things in person. And Katie and I are both looking forward to the expo and seeing everyone there. And it's been a pleasure, and I'm really looking forward to the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Awaken Empower TV with my special guest, Dr. Robert Schoch. Join me next week as we speak with another incredible individual who's standing on the leading edge and changing the world.